power crumbles in many ways, but few as grotesque as the demise of King Philip II of Spain. For a man who once controlled half the known world, his final enemy proved to be neither rival monarchs nor rebellious subjects, but something far more insidious, his own decaying flesh. As we journey through the darkened corridors of the Escorial Palace in the summer of 1598, prepare yourself for a tale where absolute power meets absolute vulnerability, where the mighty are reduced to festering prey, and where nature delivers its most brutal verdict on the hubris of King Philip II of Spain. Stood as the most powerful monarch of his age, ruler of the first global empire, master of territories spanning from the Americas to the Philippines, which bear his name to this day. The son of Emperor Charles V. Philip's dominion stretched across continents, earning him the famous boast that, in his realm the sun never sets. As defender of Catholic orthodoxy during the Counter-Reformation, he was both revered and feared, sending his mighty armada against England and funding bloody campaigns against Protestant heretics across Europe. Yet for all his worldly authority, Philip's final battle would be waged not on distant battlefields, but in the confines of his own bedchamber. For 52 days in the sweltering Spanish summer, the king, who had commanded armies and navies, would be unable to move, trapped in his own putrefying body as creatures infinitesimally smaller than the smallest of his subjects consumed him alive. This is not simply a tale of physical suffering. Though that suffering was profound, it is a meditation on the limits of human power, the inescapability of mortality, and the cruel democracy of decay. The El Escorial Palace, that Philip commissioned as both royal residence and mausoleum, would indeed become his tomb, but only after serving as the theater for his prolonged and agonizing final act within these stone walls. A king accustomed to dictating the fate of nations would find himself utterly powerless against the relentless siege of disease and parasites. Those who witnessed his final days left accounts so disturbing that historians long believed them to be exaggerations. Modern medical analysis suggests they were not. What follows is the true story of Philip II's horrific demise, a death so protracted, so gruesome, and so degrading that it serves as a memento mori for the ages. As we peel back the ornate royal bedsheets to reveal the rotting form beneath, we are reminded that in the end even kings return to dust, sometimes while still drawing breath, sometimes by inches, sometimes as living feasts for the lowest creatures of creation. The first signs of Philip's final decline appeared in the spring of 1598. At 71 years of age, the king was already elderly by the standards of his time and had spent decades battling various ailments. Gout had plagued him since his 30s, twisting his fingers and toes into NHOS appendages that made writing and walking increasingly difficult each year. The attacks grew more frequent and more severe, spreading from his extremities to his knees, wrists, and shoulders. Philip had also developed a form of arthritis so severe that courtiers described him as unable to move hand or foot, not even to scratch his head. Combined with persistent fevers, these conditions had already confined the king to a wheelchair by 1591. Still, he maintained his legendary work ethic, personally reviewing every important state document, sometimes annotating them with the simple instruction, "Know a single word," that could determine the fates of thousands across his vast empire. But in June of 1598, Philip's conditions worsened dramatically. A new round of fevers left him delirious and weakened. More concerning, numerous abscesses began to form on his right knee and hand. These pustules would rupture and drain, only to reform with greater intensity. Court physicians, limited by the medical knowledge of the time, applied piccases and prescribed bloodletting, but the infection spread relentlessly. Within weeks, the King of Spain was bedridden, able to move only his head and left arm. The mightiest monarch in Christendom found himself utterly dependent on servants for every bodily function. His proud Spanish etiquette, which had established the most formal court in Europe, crumbled in the face of basic human need. The man who had once been approached only with elaborate genuflection now lay soiled in his own excrement. When attendants could not change his bedding quickly enough as July's heat intensified, so did Philip's suffering. The abscesses multiplied, spreading across his chest, groin, and legs. From these sewer-rating wounds came a putrid stench so overwhelming that even the most devoted attendants struggled to remain in the royal chamber. The smell of rotting flesh permeated the palace corridors, causing courtiers to press perfumed handkerchiefs to their noses as they passed near the king's quarters. Philip himself, still lucid enough to understand his condition, ordered the windows kept closed, not for his comfort but to prevent the royal stench from offending those outside. Contemporary accounts described the king's body as covered in pestles that would burst and refill with blood and matter. These sores never truly healed, but instead became breeding grounds for something far worse, as the king lay unable to shift his position without experiencing excruciating pain. His sweat-soaked bedding created the perfect environment for infestation. The first lice appeared in early August. Perhaps they came with one of the palace servants, or perhaps they emerged from the increasingly fated bedding. Regardless of their origin, they found in Philip's sewer-raiding body an ideal host, warm, moist, and unable to defend itself. The parasites multiplied rapidly, feeding on the king's blood and the abundant dead tissue from his lesions. Soon witnesses reported that lice swarmed so thickly over the king that attendants could not keep his body clean, no matter how often they tried. Diego Deeps, Philip's confessor, later wrote that the lice bred within the wounds themselves, emerging from the king's own putrefying flesh. Whether this was literally true or merely appeared so to horrified observers, the effect was the same. The most powerful man in Europe had become a living hive of parasites. Some accounts suggest that specialized attendants were assigned the sole task of removing lice from the royal body, collecting them by the handfuls, only to find new swarms hours later. But the lice were merely opportunistic feeders. The true horror lay deeper within Philip's failing body. Royal physician Andres de Alfaro documented that the king's wounds began to develop putrid and corrupt matter in which many maggots were engendered. These larvae, likely of common flies that had entered through the palace windows or doors, had found their way into the king's open lesions and begun to feed on his decaying tissue. Imagine the scene: a man once treated as semi-divine, whose mere touch was believed by some to heal scrofula, now watched as worms writhed beneath his skin and emerged from his wounds. Each day servants would clean away the maggots, only to find new ones the following morning. Philip, fully conscious and increasingly reliant on his Catholic faith for comfort, supposedly remarked, "Lord, how greatly these offenses against you weigh upon me, though it pleases me to think how small they are compared to my sins." By August's end, new horrors emerged. The constant pressure against his immobile body had created massive bedsores, particularly on his right hip and lower back. These pressure ulcers, exacerbated by his inability to move and the perpetual dampness of his bedding, eventually wore through skin, fat, and muscle, exposing bone. According to royal chronicler Cedita, one ulcer on his right hip grew so large that it was possible to see into the internal cavity of his body. This nightmare wound, described as the size of a fist, developed its own grotesque ecosystem. Fray José de Sigoniza, who documented the king's final days, wrote that from this wound alone, attendants removed material enough to fill 2 silver basins daily. More disturbing, this cavernous lesion became the primary breeding ground for maggots, which multiplied faster than they could be removed. Some contemporary accounts describe how the larvae would burrow deeper when disturbed, literally consuming the king from within. The flies attracted to the king's wounds were not content to lay their eggs only in dead tissue. As Philip's condition deteriorated, they began to infest his mouth, nose, and ears as well. Unable to brush them away, the once feared monarch could only endure as insects crawled across his face and into his orifices. Some historians believe Philip may have developed myiasis, a condition where fly larvae invade living tissue in multiple sites throughout his body. Adding to this catalogue of suffering was the king's worsening gout, which made even the slightest touch to his extremities excruciating, yet his body had to be moved and cleaned each time attendants attempted to change his position or remove soiled bedding. Screams echoed through the palace halls. The monarch, who had once watched impassively as heretics burned at Otto's, now begged for mercy from his own servants throughout this horrific ordeal. Philip's mind remained largely intact. This clarity was perhaps the cruelest aspect of his deterioration. He was fully aware of his transformation from sovereign to carry, the king who had built the magnificent Escorial as a testament to Spanish glory, and his own legacy now lay rotting within its walls. Conscious of each new indignity visited upon his failing flesh, despite his agony, Philip maintained remarkable composure regarding spiritual matters. He requested daily mass be performed in his chambers, and often asked for the reading of religious texts. The man who had championed Catholic orthodoxy across Europe remained steadfast in his faith, even as his body became a theater of horrors. When able to speak between bouts of pain, he would discuss affairs of state and the future of his vast empire with his son and heir, the future Philip III. By early September, new symptoms compounded the king's suffering. Persistent diarrhea, possibly from intestinal infection, or as a side effect of his treatments, further weakened him, and added to the filth that surrounded him, his renal function began to fail, causing his legs and abdomen to swell dramatically with edema. This fluid retention stretched his already compromised skin to the breaking point, causing new ruptures that provided Additional entry points for infection and infestation. Court physician Garcia D8 documented that the king developed a high fever accompanied by delirium, likely indicating sepsis had set in his more lucid moments. Philip reportedly asked repeatedly for a particular crucifix, the same one his father, Emperor Charles V, had held as he died. This symbolic connection to his imperial legacy seemed to provide comfort, even as Philip's own bodily sovereignty dissolved into chaos and corruption. The treatments prescribed by royal physicians likely contributed to the king's suffering rather than alleviating it. Following home rule theory, doctors applied caustic substances to his wounds in an attempt to balance his bodily fluids. These chemicals, which included arsenic, compounds, and mercury, preparations would have burned his already compromised tissues and potentially accelerated necrosis. Frequent bloodletting, sometimes daily, further weakened the monarch at a time when he desperately needed his strength. Philip's diet during these final weeks consisted mainly of broths, watered wine, and soft bread when he could manage to eat at all. The combined effects of infection, parasitic infestation, blood loss from medical treatments, and inadequate nutrition created the perfect storm for his body's complete collapse. His heart, straining against increasing systemic failure, began to show signs of arrhythmia, with the king reporting palpitations and episodes of shortness of breath. Even the weather conspired against Philip. The summer of 1598 was unusually hot in central Spain, with the stone walls of the Escorial trapping heat like an oven. This elevated temperature accelerated the breeding cycles of the lice and flies, tormenting the king, and hastened the decomposition of his wounded flesh. The few windows in his chamber, kept partially closed to contain the stench, admitted little breeze to cool his fever-racked body or disperse the miasma of decay that hung like a pall over the royal bed. By the second week of September, the end was clearly approaching. Philip, still conscious despite his extreme suffering, called for his children to receive his blessing. His son, the future Philip III, who had largely been kept from witnessing the worst of his father's deterioration, was visibly shocked by the transformed figure before him. The young prince reportedly had to leave the room several times to compose himself, overcome by both the sight and smell of his once formidable father reduced to a writhing, infested shell. In a final act of kingly duty, Philip attempted to impart wisdom to his heir. According to witnesses, he warned his son about the temporary nature of earthly power, gesturing weakly to his own ruined body as evidence. "I have been treated like an old dog," he reportedly told the prince. "Remember this when you wear the crown." Whether these words were meant as a caution against pride or as a bitter acknowledgement of his abandonment by courtiers who could no longer bear his presence is unclear. On September 13, 1598, Philip requested the final sacraments. His confessor administered extreme unction anointing. What few parts of the king's body could still be touched without causing screams of agony throughout the ritual. Observers noted that flies continued to land on the holy oil, drawn by the smell of putrefaction that no amount of incense could mask in a macabre tableau that would have pleased the most ardent Venatus painter. The symbols of divine grace mingled with the evidence of mortal corruption. The king's final hours were marked by increasing respiratory distress as fluid filled his lungs, the final insult in a cascade of systemic failures. His breathing became labored and rattling, each exhale carrying the fated odor of internal decay. At 5 o'clock on the morning of September 13th, after asking for the crucifix to be placed on his chest, Philip II of Spain drew his last breath. The monarch who had commanded the wealth of the New World and the might of Europe's greatest army had finally been conquered by the smallest of adversaries. The task of preparing the royal corpse presented unprecedented challenges. Traditional embalming procedures proved nearly impossible given the advanced state of decomposition. According to court records, the body was so compromised that it began to break apart when moved. The royal embalmers worked quickly, using prodigious amounts of perfumes, spices, and preservative compounds in an attempt to make the remains presentable for lying in state. Despite these efforts, the king's body continued to deteriorate rapidly. The funeral proceedings were consequently abbreviated, with only the most essential rituals performed before the sealed casket was hurried to the royal crypt. Beneath the Escorial there, Philip was interred alongside his father and his multiple wives, his physical corruption finally hidden from view, if not from memory or history. Word of the king's horrific end spread quickly throughout Europe, eliciting varied responses in Protestant England and the Netherlands, where Philip had been viewed as a tyrant and persecutor. Accounts of his suffering were received with barely concealed satisfaction. Pamphlets circulated suggesting his gruesome death was divine retribution for the Inquisitions, tortures, and the bloodshed of the Dutch revolt. Queen Elizabeth I of England, Philip's longtime adversary reportedly remarked upon hearing the details, "We should not mock the afflictions of princes, for they remind us all of our common mortality." In Catholic territories, particularly in Spain itself, official accounts of Philip's death were sanitized, emphasizing his piety and dignity in facing his final trial court. Chronicles omitted the more disturbing details, focusing instead on his reception of the sacraments and his concern for the succession. The Spanish people were told their king had died as he had lived as a pillar of Catholic virtue and royal fortitude. Medical historians now believe Philip suffered from a combination of conditions. His long-standing gout had likely developed into a form of rheumatoid arthritis, which compromised his immune system. This, combined with diabetes, suggested by his symptoms of excessive thirst and edema, created the perfect conditions for the development of multiple infections. The specific cause of his pustules and abscesses may have been a systemic staphylococcal infection, while his immobility led to the development of stage 4 pressure ulcers that provided entry points for maggot infestation. What makes Philip's case particularly notable is not just the extent of his physical suffering, but how it functioned as a grotesque inversion of his earthly power. The monarch, who had commanded men to die in battle by the thousands, could not command the insects to leave his flesh. The king, whose word could condemn heretics to fire, could not stop his own body from becoming a breeding ground for vermin. As historian William H. Prescott later wrote, "No amount of power or wealth could purchase exemption from the physical laws to which all mortality is subject." Philip's death serves as more than just a gruesome historical footnote. It stands as a powerful memento mori, a reminder that power, no matter how absolute, offers no immunity against the fundamental vulnerabilities of the human condition. His demise represented the ultimate democratic principle that kings and commoners alike must face the indignity of physical decay. The only difference is that Philip's status ensured his suffering would be meticulously documented and remembered centuries later. The irony of his end was not lost on contemporary observers. Philip had spent decades prosecuting wars to defend Catholic orthodoxy and the divine right of kings. He had presented himself as God's chosen instrument on earth, the defender of true faith against heresy, yet his final days suggested no divine intervention, no miraculous preservation of the royal body. Instead, the most Catholic king suffered a death that seemed more like punishment than blessing. Abandoned, it appeared, by the very God whose cause he had championed for the Spanish Empire. Philip's death marked the beginning of a long, slow decline. His son Philip III lacked his father's work ethic and administrative skill. Within decades, Spain would begin to lose territories and influence, eventually surrendering its position as Europe's dominant power. Some historians have suggested that the horror of witnessing his father's end contributed to the younger Philip's reluctance to fully engage with the burdens of kingship, preferring to delegate power to favorites while pursuing pleasure. The Escorial Palace, which Philip II had envisioned as the center of global power and a monument to Spanish greatness, would never again serve as the effective command center of a world empire. Instead, it would gradually transform into what its architecture had always suggested it might become: a magnificent morale. Today, visitors can tour the royal apartments where Philip suffered his agonizing end, though they hear sanitized versions of his death that focus on his piety rather than his physical corruption. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of Philip's horrific demise is the way it has shaped our historical imagination. His death serves as a powerful reminder that the distance between the heights of human power and the depths of human vulnerability is not as great as we might wish to believe. The king who ruled half the world discovered in his final days that he could not rule the processes of his own body, a lesson as relevant to modern leaders as it was in the 16th century. For all his territorial conquests and political machinations, Philip II is perhaps most vividly remembered today for the manner of his leaving this world, not in glory on the battlefield, not in peaceful sleep surrounded by loving family, but in a protracted nightmare of corruption and consumption. His story reminds us that history's judgment often comes not in how we wield power, but in how we face its inevitable loss. From the greatest monarch of his age to food for worms, not after death, as happens to all, but while still living, still thinking, still feeling every bite. As we conclude this dark journey through the final days of Philip II, we might reflect on the words supposedly found among his private papers after his death. To have been and not to be is not to be at all, or for a king obsessed with legacy and remembrance there is bitter irony in being remembered not for the empire he built, but for the grotesque spectacle of his disintegration. His death has outlived his achievements in our collective memory, serving as a visceral reminder That power is always temporary, that glory always fades, and that in the end, nature renders all equal kings and commoners, alike returning to dust, sometimes inch by excruciating inch,